They called it the Wooden Wonder, but when the idea first reached the British Air Ministry in 1938, no one was laughing harder than the generals who were supposed to approve it. A combat aircraft made almost entirely of wood. No armor, no defensive guns, no heavy crew, just speed and plywood. To the traditionalists of the Royal Air Force, it sounded suicidal. But to one man, a quiet visionary named Geoffrey de Havilland, it sounded like the future. De Havilland had spent his career designing elegant, fast civilian aircraft. He loved simplicity, efficiency, and beauty. When the war clouds gathered over Europe, he looked at the massive bombers being planned, slow, lumbering machines loaded with gunners' armor and complexity, and he saw a trap. Speed, he argued, was the real armor. The Air Ministry didn't agree. They wanted bombers bristling with machine guns, men, and metal. But de Havilland believed that if a plane could fly high and fast enough, it wouldn't need to fight back. It could simply outrun danger altogether. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, his proposal had already been politely shelved. But de Havilland refused to give up. While London burned during the Blitz, his engineers quietly worked at their factory in Hatfield, using the only materials they could find, wood and glue. Aluminum was being rationed for Spitfires and Hurricanes. Steel was short, but wood was everywhere in British forests, carpentry shops, and furniture factories. De Havilland's idea was daring but practical. Wood was light, flexible, and, if treated properly, incredibly strong. Better yet, radar had a harder time detecting it. So, while German engineers built increasingly heavy, complex aircraft of steel, the British were shaping the sky's first ghost. By the end of 1940, a strange new aircraft rolled out of the hangar. It looked nothing like the bristling monsters of the day. Its fuselage was sleek, smooth, and pale, the color of polished birch. Its twin engines hummed with quiet menace, and its skin, made from layers of balsa and birch, shimmered faintly in the morning light. When it took off for the first time on November 25, 1940, the observers expected disaster. They watched from the runway, some snickering, some shaking their heads, but the wooden plane leapt into the air like a hunting falcon. In seconds, it was gone, a blur. The test pilot, Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., radioed back a simple line: "Gentlemen, this thing flies." Moments later, the radar operators at a nearby station called in confused. They had lost it. The prototype had climbed faster than anything they'd ever tracked, and then simply vanished from their screens. That was the first time the British realized that something extraordinary had just been born. A weapon so fast it was almost invisible. By early 1941, word of the wooden aircraft began to spread through RAF circles. Some called it a miracle. Others still called it madness. But in Germany, the Luftwaffe's intelligence dismissed the rumors entirely. The idea of a wooden British aircraft faster than a Messerschmitt 109 was laughable. German engineers prided themselves on precision, metal, rivets, and machinery. A plane made of furniture materials was a joke too absurd to fear. They didn't realize that within 2 years, that same joke would be flying above their cities, photographing their defenses, bombing their factories, and outrunning every fighter they sent after it. The first prototypes were stripped of armor, stripped of guns, even stripped of paint to save weight. All they had were two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines and pure aerodynamic grace. When RAF Command finally allowed a demonstration, the generals watched in stunned silence as the Mosquito, still unarmed, still unfinished, outflew every pursuit aircraft on the field. It wasn't just fast, it was impossibly fast, over 400 miles per hour, at a time when most fighters struggled to reach 350, and so, in the middle of a war built on metal, the most advanced combat aircraft in the world was built out of wood. The irony was perfect, the simplicity terrifying. What began as laughter soon turned into disbelief. The Air Ministry, suddenly realizing what they had nearly ignored, ordered it into full production. The aircraft received its name officially in 1941, de Havilland Mosquito, 2 years later. Its nickname, the Wooden Wonder, would be whispered in German radio chatter with a very different tone. By then, it wasn't a joke. It was a nightmare. When the first operational Mosquito squadrons formed in early 1942, no one quite knew what to do with them. They were too fast to fly in formation with slower bombers, too light to carry the same payloads, too valuable to risk on ordinary missions. So the RAF gave them the most dangerous jobs: reconnaissance over occupied Europe. Mosquito pilots flew alone deep behind enemy lines. With cameras instead of guns, they photographed targets by day, by night, even in storms, then raced home at altitudes and speeds no German plane could match. When Luftwaffe interceptors tried to engage, the Mosquito simply climbed higher and higher until the Germans' engines choked. When flak batteries opened fire, the wooden frame absorbed shock that would have shattered aluminum. Soon, RAF intelligence officers began receiving photographs so clear that they could count windows in Gestapo buildings. And when the Germans realized what was happening, they tried to catch the ghosts. They failed. By late 1942, the Mosquito was doing more than spying. It was striking back. On December 31st, a squadron of Mosquitoes crossed the North Sea under heavy clouds and attacked a radio station near Oslo. The Germans were stunned. No radar had detected them. No fighters intercepted them. The next morning, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda paper tried to dismiss it as a lucky attack by a few fast planes. But the truth was harder to ignore. A handful of wooden aircraft had humiliated the Luftwaffe and escaped untouched. By early 1943, the Mosquito was being deployed as a bomber. It could carry a 4,000-pound cookie blast bomb, the same payload as a 4-engine Lancaster, at nearly twice the speed. It was, as one RAF officer said, the perfect insult. By early 1943, the Mosquito had gone from a curiosity to a legend whispered among Allied crews. Pilots volunteered to fly it, even knowing the odds of returning were slim. There was something intoxicating about it: the raw speed, the elegance, the freedom from heavy guns and clumsy turrets. It was like no other aircraft in the war. Its role expanded quickly. It became a precision bomber, a pathfinder for larger formations, and even a fighter bomber armed with rockets and cannons. In every version, its philosophy remained the same: speed over armor, intelligence over brute force. The Mosquito's true test came in the skies over Germany. On January 30th, 1943, the Luftwaffe planned a grand radio broadcast to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. Göring himself was to speak live from Berlin. He wanted to show the world that Germany still ruled the skies. But across the channel, a small group of Mosquito pilots prepared something special. 3 unarmed, unescorted aircraft took off from England in the cold morning air. Their mission: to silence Göring's speech. Flying at treetop level to avoid radar, they crossed the North Sea and climbed over Berlin just as the broadcast began. At precisely 11 o'clock a.m., the first bombs exploded above the city. Göring's speech was cut off mid-sentence. The German radio went silent. Less than 20 minutes later, as another high-ranking Nazi official began a separate speech in Berlin, the same squadron returned and bombed that one too. It was humiliation on a national scale. In the following days, Joseph Goebbels fumed in private. It's not even metal. A wooden plane has shamed us in front of all Germany. Even Hermann Göring himself, the once proud head of the Luftwaffe, could not hide his rage. He reportedly shouted to his officers, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British can build a beautiful wooden plane that every German pilot fears. We can't even shoot the damn thing down." The irony was unbearable. The Reich that prided itself on its superior technology was being humiliated by plywood. The Mosquito raids became symbols of defiance. The British press loved them. The headlines read, "Wood beats iron. But behind the triumph was brutal reality. These missions were deadly. Mosquito pilots often flew alone, without escort, deep into enemy territory. If they were hit, the wooden frame ignited instantly. There was no armor, no parachute guarantee, just skill and faith in speed. They were, as one pilot said, men who rode on fire. That spring, the Mosquito struck again, and this time, not for propaganda, but for vengeance. In February 1944, intelligence reported that the Gestapo was holding French resistance leaders in a prison in Amiens. The Germans planned to execute them within days. The only way to save them was to destroy the walls of the prison itself, without killing the prisoners inside. It was an impossible mission. But impossible was what the Mosquito did best. At 12:01 p.m. on February 18, 1944, a formation of mosquitoes flew in at rooftop height, so low that one clipped a tree and kept flying. The first bombs tore open the prison's outer wall. Seconds later, others hit the guard barracks. Prisoners poured into the snow, running for freedom through the smoke. The Germans then barely reacted. The raid lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, the prison lay in ruins, but hundreds of resistance fighters had escaped. The operation, codenamed Jericho, became one of the most daring rescues of the war. It also confirmed the Mosquito's new reputation, not just a bomber, not just a scout, but a precision instrument of justice. Across Europe, resistance groups whispered of the wooden avenger that struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. The Luftwaffe, now on the defensive, tried everything to stop it. They set traps, moved radar stations, launched jet interceptors. Nothing worked. The Mosquito flew too high, too fast, and too unpredictably. The new German jet, the Me-262, was faster on paper, but it could barely reach altitude before the Mosquito was gone. Again and again, Mosquito crews slipped through German defenses to deliver blows that seemed impossible, bombing the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo and The Hague, striking Berlin in broad daylight, disabling radio towers during live Nazi broadcasts. Everywhere it went, the same pattern followed: disbelief, panic, then admiration. German soldiers began to nickname it der Holzgeist, the wooden ghost. One captured Luftwaffe pilot admitted to British interrogators, "When we saw that long, thin silhouette in the distance, we didn't chase. We prayed it wasn't coming for us." Inside the Reich, paranoia grew. Göring ordered that any Mosquito flying over Berlin be shot down at all costs. He deployed special anti-aircraft units, stationed night fighters on 24-hour alert, and demanded that engineers create faster planes. It didn't matter. The Mosquito came and went as it pleased, dropping bombs on Berlin in daylight and returning home without a scratch. British radio operators began jokingly scheduling their attacks to interrupt German speeches. "Let's ruin his tea time today," one pilot said before takeoff. By 1944, Mosquito squadrons were operating all over Europe, from Norway to Italy, from the Bay of Biscay to the Balkans. They attacked rail yards, bridges, U-boat pens, and airfields. They scouted the beaches before D-Day. They photographed the V-1 and V-2 rocket sites before they were even operational. Wherever the enemy built, the Mosquito appeared, silent, sudden, unstoppable. But behind the sleek beauty of the aircraft, there was always cost. Every mission carried risk. The Mosquito's wooden construction gave it speed, but also fragility. One hit, one spark, and the plane could become a fireball in seconds. Veterans described the sound of flak ripping through wood, a hollow, terrifying crack, and the smell of burning varnish that followed. Yet they flew anyway. Some say it was because they trusted the plane more than anything else. Others because it made them feel untouchable. A Mosquito pilot once said, "We weren't armored, we weren't protected, but we were free." The Mosquito gave us wings, not cages. In the spring of 1944, one mission would push that freedom and that faith to its absolute limit. It began, as many great stories do, with a laugh. High Command received intelligence that the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen had become a fortress. Dozens of Danish resistance members were imprisoned there, tortured daily. Destroying the building was considered impossible. It sat in the middle of a civilian block, near a school dock, but for the mosquito, impossible was nearly a challenge. On the morning of March 21, 1945, 20 mosquitoes crossed the Danish coast under heavy clouds. They flew so low that their propellers left ripples on the lakes below. The lead pilot, Group Captain Peter Barker, could see the rooftops of Copenhagen. They dove through the mist, straight toward the city. German guards saw them at the last second, too late. The first wave struck the Gestapo building head-on, blasting it into ruins. But then tragedy struck. One mosquito hit a lamp post, crashed into a nearby school, and the next wave, seeing the fire, mistook it for the target. Civilians were killed that day. Teachers, children, even heroes make mistakes. The surviving pilots returned in silence. For days, the RAF refused to speak of the raid, and yet the Danish people still called it liberation. The fall of the Gestapo in Copenhagen marked the symbolic end of German terror in Denmark. It was the last great daylight raid of the Mosquito War. The wooden plane had done what no one believed possible. It had fought steel with timber, precision with courage, and won. By the time the war ended, over 7,700 mosquitoes had been built. They had flown more than 30,000 missions: reconnaissance, bombing, pathfinding, interception. They had served in every major Allied theater, and despite their fragile appearance, they recorded one of the lowest loss rates of any bomber in the war. When the guns fell silent in 1945, even the Germans, the same men who once laughed, admitted their respect. Captured Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland summed it up simply: the British Mosquito was the most beautiful and the most dangerous aircraft in the world. When the war turned in favor of the Allies in late 1944, the Mosquito had already become a legend. In the night skies over Germany, its engines hummed like distant thunder, a sound every German soldier learned to fear. They called it the ghost above Europe. It could appear anywhere, at any hour, and then vanish before radar or interceptors could respond. By that stage of the war, Britain had refined the Mosquito into multiple forms. There were fast bombers, night fighters, pathfinders, reconnaissance planes, and even intruders, aircraft that hunted German bombers as they returned home to land. It was versatility born from simplicity, the same wooden frame, shaped for a dozen deadly purposes. One of the most feared was the night fighter Mosquito, equipped with onboard radar and for 20mm cannons in the nose. When German bombers tried to raid London in the dark, they met invisible predators that struck from behind and disappeared. The Mosquito was the silent executioner of the night. By 1945, Allied airmen had a new saying: if it's fast, if it's quiet, if it's deadly, it's a Mosquito. It was ironic. The same aircraft the RAF had once doubted now defended Britain's skies and terrorized Germany's. In early 1945, as the Allied armies crossed the Rhine, Mosquitoes roamed freely over Germany. They destroyed bridges, strafed convoys, and photographed entire cities reduced to dust. From high above, their cameras captured the fall of the Reich in brutal clarity. Smoking ruins where once stood proud cities. The Germans had no answer. Even as jet aircraft like the Me-262 appeared, their numbers were too few. The Mosquito still ruled the air at medium altitude. It could carry a bomb load of 4,000 pounds, the same as a heavy bomber, but with half the crew and twice the survival rate. In a war that had begun with steel and arrogance, the final years belonged to speed, ingenuity, and would. The Mosquito became the embodiment of a new kind of warfare: clean, precise, efficient. It didn't overwhelm the enemy with numbers. It humiliated them with cleverness. For men like Hermann Goering, it was the ultimate insult. His Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now powerless to stop an airplane made of balsa and glue. Goering's frustration grew into obsession. He demanded that Germany build something faster. He threw resources at new prototypes, the Me-262, the Arado-234 jet bomber. But it was too late. The Reich was collapsing, and every innovation came too slowly. The Mosquito, meanwhile, grew only faster. Improved engines, lighter materials, and refined aerodynamics made it a near-perfect machine by the end of the war. One of its most famous missions came in April 1945, just weeks before the end. A pair of Mosquitoes from the 608 Squadron flew deep into Germany to destroy the Gestapo archives in Copenhagen and Aarhus, which contained names of thousands of resistance members. If the Germans retreated with those lists, entire families could be executed. Flying low under heavy flak, the Mosquitoes struck the buildings with surgical precision. The records were incinerated. The resistance was saved. It was one of the last times the wooden planes flew into enemy fire. But what they accomplished with that final mission was symbolic. They had started as an experiment the RAF had mocked. Now they ended as protectors of those who had fought the war in the shadows. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the Mosquito squadrons returned home. Pilots walked across the airfields they had left as boys and returned to as legends. For many, the realization of what they had flown came only then. During the war, they had treated it as a machine, something to trust but not think about. In peace, they began to appreciate its elegance, its audacity. They began to see what Jeffrey de Havilland had seen from the start, that simplicity could be genius, and genius could look like madness. But not everyone who flew a Mosquito lived to see peace. The cost had been heavy. Many crews never returned. Those who did carried the memories like burn marks on their souls, the smell of burning wood, the sight of tracers whipping past their wings, the sound of the Merlin engines straining at the edge of silence. In interviews after the war, one navigator described it best: "We had no guns to comfort us. Just trust in our pilot, trust in the machine, trust in luck." And that trust was everything. Another pilot said that the Mosquito made him feel alive in death's company. Every flight was a conversation with fate, he said. Sometimes the Mosquito spoke faster. As Europe rebuilt itself, so did de Havilland. The war had proven what his team already knew, that innovation could thrive even in ruins. The Mosquito's success laid the groundwork for post-war aviation. The same engineers who shaped its wooden body would later design the world's first commercial jet airliner, the de Havilland Comet. But before the jet age arrived, the Mosquito had one more chapter to write. In the late 1940s, the wooden plane found new roles. It became a film star, a mail carrier, a photo reconnaissance platform, even a racing aircraft. Pilots used to the cold fear of war now flew it through calm skies, still marveling at how smooth and light it felt. One RAF officer called it the only warplane that truly felt alive. Its twin engines, once the sound of war, now carried mail between London and Cairo. It had outlasted the empire it helped save. In Germany, captured officers still spoke of it with awe. Many admitted that the Mosquito had shaken their faith in technology. They had spent years perfecting heavier, stronger machines, and had been defeated by something their own scientists dismissed as childish. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe ace who survived the war, once said in an interview, "The Mosquito, that was the most perfect warplane ever built. It was faster than our fighters, carried more than our bombers, and did both without armor. We couldn't match it, not in the air, not in the factory, not in spirit." His words echoed what the whole world already knew. The Mosquito had not just changed the war. It had changed the idea of what war could be. It proved that intelligence could outrun power, that innovation could defeat arrogance, and that even in an age of destruction, duty could still fly. In 1946, Jeffrey de Havilland was knighted for his contributions to aviation. At the ceremony, he was asked about his proudest achievement. He paused for a long moment, then said softly, "The Mosquito, because it shouldn't have worked, and yet it did. beautifully. When asked what he thought of the laughter his design first received, he smiled faintly. They laughed, he said. Then they chased it. Then they couldn't catch it. In the following years, the mosquito slowly faded from active service. Metal jets replaced it, and newer technologies made it obsolete. But for those who had seen it streak across the sky, a blur of pale wood and silver light, it was unforgettable. Even as the world turned to the cold gleam of steel and aluminum, the memory of the wooden wonder remained warm, almost human. It wasn't just an airplane. It was a statement that sometimes what the world mocks is exactly what will save it. By the 1950s, most surviving mosquitoes were decommissioned or destroyed. A few ended up in museums. Others, quietly, were left to rot in forgotten airfields, their wooden skin cracking under the sun. But even in decay, they looked proud, like old knights whose armor had turned to dust but whose spirit remained unbroken. Visitors still stop to look at them. Even today, they see the curved nose, the long wings, the graceful shape that defied logic. And if they listen carefully, they can almost hear the faint hum of two Merlin engines, echoing from another age, a sound that once made the most powerful air force in the world tremble. Time has a way of sanding down the edges of history. What once roared now hums in memory, and the things that once terrified nations become quiet relics behind glass. Yet some machines carry something deeper than metal or wood, a soul, an echo of human defiance that refuses to fade. The de Havilland mosquito is one of them. Long after the war, veterans still spoke of it in reverent tones, not as a weapon, but as a companion, a living thing that had carried them through the fire and brought them home. For many, it was not just a plane. It was a promise that courage and imagination could still exist in the darkest of times. One RAF pilot, interviewed in the 1960s, said, "The mosquito wasn't a machine. It was an idea that if you're clever enough, you can win without being stronger." And that, I think, was the point of the whole war. That idea of using wit instead of might became the foundation of post-war aviation. Every jet, every stealth design, every light composite aircraft owes a quiet debt to the wooden ghost that first proved the concept. But in its own time, the mosquito also carried a deeper, more weight. The men who flew it did not have the comfort of overwhelming firepower. They had no armor, no turrets, no squadrons to hide behind. Each mission was a wager, the skill of human hands against the fury of a world at war. And yet, again and again, those hands triumphed. They flew into flak storms, through darkness and cold, guided only by instinct and a few glowing dials. They faced enemies faster on paper, but slower in heart. They risked everything for a cause that was never certain. Flying planes that by all logic should not have survived, and somehow always did. It's easy to forget that the mosquito wasn't just a marvel of engineering. It was a triumph of belief that one man's vision, ridiculed, dismissed, mocked, could still change everything. Belief that speed could be armor. Belief that wood could beat steel. Belief that the impossible was sometimes just the untried. When the laughter began in 1938, no one could have imagined that it would end in smoke over Berlin. The same German officers who once joked about furniture planes later watched their cities burn under its bombs. The same generals who dismissed it as fantasy later cursed its name in frustration. That reversal, that poetic symmetry, is why the mosquito story endures. Because it isn't just about technology or war. It's about what happens when human arrogance meets quiet genius. The Germans had the best materials, the most advanced science, the finest factories. But the British had something different. They had desperation, creativity, and the courage to try something ridiculous. And that, as history has proven time and again, is often the difference between losing and winning. In post-war Germany, captured engineers studied the mosquito in disbelief. They took its pieces apart, measured its joints, weighed its skin. One scientist reportedly muttered, "It's too simple. It shouldn't have worked, but it did." And in that simplicity lay its perfection. That's the paradox of genius. It often looks like madness until it succeeds. In museums today, the mosquito looks almost fragile. Its wooden panels, carefully restored, gleam under soft light. Children press their hands to the glass, surprised to learn that something that looked so delicate once ruled the skies. But if you stand close enough, you can still sense what it was, not fragile, but fearless. You can imagine it tearing through the clouds at 400 miles an hour. Low over the channel, sunlight flashing off its wings. You can picture its crew, 2 men in thick jackets, faces pale, eyes fixed on the horizon, trusting the hum of twin merlins and the thin skin of birch beneath their feet, and somewhere behind them, invisible on the ground, the laughter that once followed them has long since died. Jeffrey de Havilland didn't live to see how far his vision would go. He died in 1965. But his philosophy lived on in every aircraft that came after, from the first British jets to the Concorde and beyond. He never sought glory, only understanding. He once wrote in a letter, "I have no interest in building the biggest or the strongest. I only wish to build what flies best." That modest sentence became the foundation of British aviation for decades, and it all began with a handful of engineers, a few tons of plywood, and a dream that the world laughed at. There's a quiet moment in every great story of pause where the lesson becomes clear. In the mosquito's story, that moment comes not during its victories, but after them. When the war ended, the plane was no longer needed. The wooden factories shut down. The engineers went home. The world moved on to steel and jet engines. And yet, even in its obsolescence, the mosquito never really disappeared. Its spirit lingers in the quiet bravery of those who do not fit the mold, in the stubbornness of those who refuse to stop trying, in the spark of invention that lights even in times of despair. The laughter that once greeted it has become admiration. The mockery has become myth. The world forgot most of the machines of that war, but not this one, because the mosquito's story isn't about a plane. It's about possibility. The possibility that genius can hide in simplicity, that courage can exist without armor, that something built of fragile things can change the course of history. It's about the moment when a man refuses to believe the word impossible, and in doing so, proves everyone wrong. In the end, every war leaves behind its ghosts. Most are tragic, some are haunting, but a rare few, are beautiful. The mosquito is one of them, a ghost of wood and wind, a reminder that imagination, not iron, wins the future. And so, when the German crews laughed at the idea of a wooden plane, they laughed at the very thing that would outfly them, outthink them, and outlast them. Because, in the skies of 1944, as those sleek wooden wings cut through the clouds faster than any metal could follow, the world learned a lesson that still echoes today: never underestimate what the world calls impossible. They laughed at the wooden plane until it outran them.